Roman Svytan, military expert, is joining our broadcast. Roman Grigorievich, hello, we're glad to see you.
Greetings. I wish everyone good health.
Likewise, let's discuss the following. An interesting event happened last night. Strike drones attacked an oil refinery. It's called Orsk-Nefteorgzintezh, which is located in the city of Orsk-Orenburg region. It's known that Orsk was attacked by strike drones of an airplane-like type. According to preliminary data, at least 2 drones flew directly into the oil refinery. There was an alarm signal and so on and so forth. Interestingly, it is located about 1,400 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. And it processed quite a lot, 6.6 million tons of oil per year. How do you assess such hits? I know that you closely monitor this particular trend of our strikes on oil refineries. I want to hear your analysis.
The only way to destroy the Russian army is by collapsing the Russian Federation itself. Any army is a derivative of the state. In other words, if you destroy the state, the army will fall apart on its own, scatter, disperse, however you want to put it. Without funding, without sufficient military aid or supplies, no army can exist at all. And to collapse the Russian Federation, as we've been discussing for years, the way to do it is through strikes on the Russian energy system and everything connected to it, everything related to Russian energy, naturally including the oil and gas sector, since it brings in well over $100 billion annually to the Russian treasury. These are exactly the funds that sustain the Russian army and even the Russian state itself, since most of the Russian republics are subsidized from Moscow. If the flow of foreign currency from Moscow stops, the republics will scatter in all directions, just like what happened with the Soviet Union. It's roughly the same situation, only this time it needs to be created. More than 30 years ago, the international community created a situation by lowering oil prices, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. This time we can create that situation ourselves by destroying Russian oil refineries, the Russian oil and gas sector, and by cutting off the flow of petrodollars, specifically to achieve the collapse of the Russian Empire. That's exactly why we keep emphasizing the importance of continuing this work, not just in isolated cases, but in a systematic way. As we can see now, for the 3rd month in a row, there has been a systematic destruction carried out by all our agencies, Ukraine's defense forces, special services, the main intelligence directorate, and the security service, as in this case with the Orsk refinery. The security service has done its job. The foreign intelligence service is working. Special operations forces are working. Drone units, the Air Force, the Navy are all directly involved in destroying precisely these Russian oil facilities. Well, the security service of Ukraine, I think the guys there are still at least in good spirits. They also highlighted the lair of the Russian orcs, the Russian city of Orsk. There, after all, 6.5 million tons isn't such a huge amount for processing, but still, it's a refinery, not a minor one. Getting there 1,500 kilometers was rather difficult, to put it mildly, unless, for example, it was done from Kazakh or Azerbaijani territory, which is closer.
Roman Grigorievich, here's what I'd like to ask you. Mardan, a figure in Russian propaganda, said the following. They claim that these drones could have been launched from Kazakhstan, supposedly because nothing from Ukraine would have reached the target, and they suggest carrying out a special military operation to clear out everything all the way to Astana. Please tell us, how real are the threats towards Kazakhstan from the Russians? So is there any real military component to this threat at any level?
Well, that blogger is not quite right. The thing is, it would have reached the target. Our reprats have reached that far before. The range is about the same. In fact, we've operated against Orsk as well, by the way, we have. So that's not a problem. 1,500 kilometers, for example, for a light aircraft converted into a drone is absolutely not a big problem. So in this case, it's actually a bit different. There is such a possibility. That's why I said it. They could have operated from Azerbaijani territory, from Kazakh territory. They could have, yes, of course, they could have. Obviously, it wasn't the Kazakhs who did it, although our Kazakh brothers are definitely helping us. And moreover, they understand these Russian attempts, including trying to create the same problems as in Ukraine, including in northern Kazakhstan, and that region is overpopulated. There is this area in northern Kazakhstan that is overpopulated by people who once came from the Russian Federation, who moved onto Kazakh land and stayed there. But they, understanding what the Russian army could bring right into their own home, into northern Kazakhstan, are staying put and not making any sudden moves. So at the moment, there is absolutely no response at all. The question is, in principle, there's nothing to react to because the calls by Russian bloggers to break in somewhere especially after the Russian army fled from Syria and withdrew from Nagorno-Karabakh. Why did they all run away from there after all? It's because they can't handle a second front. The Russian army is now, with its last remaining strength, trying to fulfill the task of the so-called great helmsman of so-called Muscovy, meaning Putin, of course, in quotation marks, to fulfill the task, to at least snatch something from Ukraine, even if it means the destruction of 1.5 to 200,000 Russian soldiers. So that's their problem. After that, they definitely won't be thinking about Kazakhstan. They can only puff up their cheeks, launch some rhetoric into the information space, but there won't be any concrete actions. So basically, our Kazakh brothers can sleep peacefully.
Roman Grigorievich, NBC News reports that the Trump administration intends to help the armed forces of Ukraine expand their strikes on Russian energy facilities, meaning they plan to provide intelligence of a new type or higher quality with more detailed information. Tell me, do you truly think the United States administration could genuinely resort to such extreme measures, especially considering everything that former President Trump has previously said about Vladimir Putin, who is clearly not at all inclined or willing to make any kind of peace?
Well, here we need to separate things into two directions. There is rhetoric, yes, these are geopolitical issues connected to certain grievances, even on some specific points. And this rhetoric is not always connected to actual actions. How many days have we been hearing rhetoric about Tomahawks now? It's been more than a week or even several weeks we've been hearing about Tomahawks, but in reality there are no missiles. And it's unlikely that there will be Tomahawks specifically. That is, there could naturally be some other types. It's the same situation here. There's a certain flow of information going on. It's a kind of sparring, I would say, between Washington and Moscow right now. However, this playful sparring, as they often say, is very much like youngsters arguing amongst themselves just for the sheer fun of it all, without any real malice or serious intent behind their actions. I mean, it's not even clear what the relationship is between Trump and Putin. Suddenly they might be in this escalation mode, which could then turn back into a mode of making up again. It happens, it's not a problem. But specifically, let's talk about actions. So the second case is about actions. Actions, for example, by the same American intelligence agencies, like passing us information from the Pentagon, providing us with certain types of information. We constantly receive information that is intelligence data, especially about the immediate rear areas. It's coming to us all the time. They practically never stop providing it. There was, for a while, along the Kursk direction on Russian territory. Yes, there was a moment when they pulled the information when we were withdrawing from Kursk. But in reality, of course, we receive constant online information, but only about the immediate Russian rear areas. For example, what do we need? And most likely, that's exactly the kind of information being referred to. We need information on the locations of Russian surface-to-air missile systems, Russian radar stations, and the radio technical troops of the Russian Federation so that we can plan proper, well-thought-out routes to reach our targets, including those in the Russian energy sector. In other words, what we need most is military intelligence on the locations of the enemy's air defense systems at various levels. Moreover, this information is directly related to military operations and to civilian flights as well, because some stations, Russians are actually committing war crimes here. Some radar stations, including those used for civil aviation, which are classified under a certain nomenclature according to ICAO, are being used by them, and their information is also being utilized for military purposes. So all this information being available online is very important for us to plot the correct routes, to calculate algorithms for countering Russian air defense, and to strike at Russia's energy facilities, which we are already aware of ourselves. Well, where would those nuclear power plants go over the past decades? They're not going to just get up and run away somewhere like hens after all. So just as they were there, they remain there. Naturally, no one is going to show us anything new in that regard. But the real military situation, especially from the perspective of air defense and countering air defense, is of course being relayed to us by the Americans.
Putin is now reporting on the territories that have been captured. Let's check his facts and do our own fact-checking. So at the Valdai Forum, he said that the Western group of troops has practically taken one of the settlements, namely Kupiansk. The center is in our hands, blah, blah, blah. Fighting is taking place in the southern part of the city. How accurate are his statements, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, they took Bilohorivka 3 or 4 times completely, so much so that they had to fire the commander. We all remember that whole saga around Bilohorivka because of unreliable information. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Putin was given information stating that Kupiansk had been captured. Naturally, he broadcasted all of this because he needed to. He needed to show at least some kind of victorious advance by the Russian army, which at this point is mostly advancing to the next world, to Kobzon's concerts. A very large number of Russian troops are dying, up to 1,000 practically, on the Eastern Front, well, really across the entire active section of the front. At the moment, he's not going to talk about that because it's entirely possible that Putin truly believes the Russian army is now in the center of Kupiansk, which of course does not reflect the real situation, since urban fighting is mainly taking place in the areas where the Russian army has broken through. There really are breakthroughs there, though I wouldn't even call it a breakthrough. It's more like infiltration of small tactical groups along certain streets, through the back alleys on the outskirts of Pokrovsk. But this is exactly what is called urban combat. In other words, these are battles taking place in civilian buildings. The situation there is not so easy for us. Yes, obviously it's tough. They are trying to encircle Kupiansk. They came in from the north, approached from the forest, practically entering the so-called civilian sector, spreading out along several streets. Right now they're trying to push them out, but nowhere near the center. In other words, they're as far from the center as they are from Kyiv, crawling on all fours. Although, let me repeat, the situation there is really tough because Russian drones and Russian aviation are practically dominating in that direction. For us, it's important now to carry out certain operations at some positions, in addition to conducting counter-sabotage operations in the city itself, basically to conduct a military operation already on the right bank of the Oskil. Until we push the Russians back across the Oskil, that is, to the eastern bank, it will be difficult for Kupiansk itself, because the advance on Kupiansk is coming from both sides of the Oskil, from the left and the right bank.
Roman Grigorievich, in conclusion.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Putin once again tried to claim that Tomahawks are outdated, useless weapons, but nevertheless he said that the study of Tomahawk usage methods is ongoing, more precisely the methodology, and how actively the Americans can assist the Ukrainian side in this. He also threatened that this would be considered direct US involvement. We've been discussing this topic in the information space for about a week now, you know. Are the Russians really that afraid of Tomahawks? Remind our audience, what is the difference between these missiles and why are they so often mentioned in Russia itself?
Well, if we speak with sarcasm, we could say to Putin, yes, of course, we confirm that we don't need it. As soon as we get them, we don't need them, so we'll just send them straight to Moscow. Why would we keep them for ourselves? So in this sense, you could play along with Putin, and then he'll have to deal with this rather powerful weapon. Why are they afraid of it? First of all, the range. These missiles can cover distances from 1,500 to 2,500 kilometers, depending on the type of missile and its warhead configuration. Of course, we're talking about conventional weapons. No one is going to give us nukes in this regard, although who knows what you could put in there. But still, the range makes it possible to reach Putin's Uralvagonzavod in the Urals. In other words, these are the missiles that can be launched and accomplish combat missions against military targets, since the warheads of these missiles are capable of carrying out such tasks. That is, some of the warheads are half a ton, mostly high explosive fragmentation, but there are actually tandem ones as well. Like I said, it all depends on the type and the warhead and the missile itself too. The thing is, the Russians understand perfectly well, and Putin definitely gets this. If they're letting our drones through, slow-moving, low-speed, low-altitude drones, and letting through a fairly large number of them, then Tomahawks will definitely get through to certain targets as well. Maybe, yes, they won't reach Moscow. The air defense density there is quite powerful, and no one is going to send them there anyway. It's 500 kilometers to Moscow. Why waste a missile that can travel 2,000 kilometers on a target only 500 kilometers away? They'll go to the Urals, and then you can write off all the Ural factories, and that's half of Russia's military power. And all of this, of course, will depend on the number of Tomahawks themselves. That is, naturally, everything directly depends on the quantity. If not dozens, but hundreds of missiles are transferred to us, for example, and such a possibility exists, at least theoretically or technically, since up to 10,000 of them have been produced. About the same number are on combat duty. So even if we get 10% of the total number of missiles, if we receive several hundred of these missiles and send them to the Ural factories, then, I repeat once again, we can put an end to it. Why? To the Russian war machine, because it's very difficult to shoot down this missile once it enters open operational space, so to speak. The main thing is for it to break through the frontal air defense, the Russian frontal air defense. We have breakthroughs, we have mechanisms for breaking through, our drones get through, so there are ways to provide cover, and then the missile can proceed. possibly following the terrain using a digital map of the area which the Americans have and of course will provide to us. It can hug the ground beneath the beams of Russian radars and no one will be able to see it at all. Not only will they not intercept it, they won't even see it. When it switches to this mode, under the so-called radio horizon, it can slip through the entire 2,000 kilometers and essentially only later at Ural Vagon Zavod, when they're clearing the debris after strikes from several dozen missiles, will they be able to determine which missiles actually made it there. That's why basically I would say that right now the Russians are seriously nervous. Even after the statements, so far these statements have almost no real basis for a change in rhetoric at least, and in general the statements about Tomahawks have already made the Russians tremble. We can hear that tremble in Putin's voice.
Thank you very much, Roman Grigorievich. It would be nice, yes, if after this trembling we could also see his frightened eyes from the incoming strikes, which he will clearly see in the reports, but we'll discuss that next time. Thank you. Roman Svytan, military expert, was on the air of Ukraine today. All the best to you. Goodbye.
Goodbye for now, my friend. I'll see you again very soon.